A common challenge in game development is creating the perfect level of difficulty for the player. If it's too easy, they might get bored, but if it's too hard, they'll get frustrated. There's a few ways to handle this, like multiple difficulty options, or some kind of invisible adaptive difficulty, or one of my new favorite solutions, assist mode. Made popular by Celeste, you're able to tweak specific aspects of the game to make it easier for certain players. But it's all optional, and the game encourages you not to use it unless you really have to. I was inspired by this and implemented a very similar menu for my game. You can give yourself tons of extra health and armor, more damage, extra loot, but my favorite options are the speed adjustments. I put in a movement speed multiplier, and the higher it goes, the faster the player will run. I capped it at a 200% increase, which is very fun to play around with. The other speed adjustment is the global game speed. So if I bump this up to a 100% increase, the whole game runs twice as fast. You can also decrease the speed, so here it's running at 50%. This has been helpful with looking at each individual frame of an animation so I can make sure it's implemented properly. The way that this game speed modifier works is pretty simple. Every video game has an update loop, which calculates any given frame. This DT, or delta time value, represents the amount of time between the previous frame and the current one. So if we're running at 60 frames per second, that means that DT will be 1/60th, or about 0.017. The game then uses this value to calculate movement. It handles timers, tweens, animations, and anything else that needs to behave the same regardless of the frame rate. There's nothing stopping me from manually adjusting this DT value. For example, if I divide it by 2, then the game will think that half as much time has passed since the previous frame, and everything will move half as fast. Instead of this, I put in a game time adjust value, which gets updated by the assist options UI. By default, it's 0, meaning that DT will not be changed at all. But if it's more or less than 0, the game speed will change. All of these assist options are able to stack with each other, so plus 200% movement speed and plus 200% game speed, it's a very fast experience. I hope someone eventually tries to speedrun the whole game like this. I also hope that these assist options will help certain players with completing the game, while also keeping it clearly optional for the really skilled players. Recently, I've also been spending time on improving the main character. Part of this was working on the sprite sheet. This is an image file that contains every frame of every animation for the player. If you look closely at this version, there's tons of duplicate sprites, and it's not very organized. I redid all of the animations to fit this new sprite sheet, where I trimmed down the total number of sprites and made a much clearer layout for everything. Also, every animation in the top half has a corresponding frame in the bottom half. So in the code, it defaults to the top section of sprites, but if the player is ever facing upwards, it'll jump down to the bottom section. It's also important to consider that the player is drawn in layers. In order to make this look like the player is picking up weapons, there needs to be some overlap between the weapon and the player's head. If the weapon is fully behind the player, it looks a bit weird, and obviously it can't be fully in front either. The solution is that every frame of the game, I first draw the player's body, then on top of that I draw the weapon, and finally I draw the head on top of that. In order to actually make these different layers for the player, I saved a second copy of the sprite sheet, and in this one I manually erased the body in every frame. Then when I draw the animation, I use this sprite sheet instead of the full one. I took this a step further and I separated every part of the player into its own layer, and when the player gets rendered, it draws each layer one by one. There's a few reasons why I took the time to do this. The first reason is for the arm of the player. When you're not holding a weapon, the character's arm is resting down. But if you do have a weapon, the arm is raised up to hold it. In my original sprite sheet, this was handled very inefficiently. I manually made duplicates of each animation and altered only the arm. With my new layer setup, I don't need to make whole new animations. Instead, since I have a separate arm layer, I can just swap out the sprite sheet for that layer alone without changing anything else. The other big benefit of the additional layers is added color customization. In my game, you can find dyes that let you change the color of your clothes. This is just cosmetic, but any amount of personalization is always a good thing. I originally got this idea from Kirby and the Amazing Mirror. In that game, you find spray paint, and each one unlocks a new color for Kirby that you can play as. Again, it's just cosmetic, but when I was a kid, I was really excited to use every new color that I found, so I wanted to do the same thing in my game. And now, since each part of the player is on its own layer, and I did this for every color, that means I can mix and match these different player colors together. I updated the UI to let you specify which parts you want to apply that dye to, and this opens up a lot more options for how you can customize the character. Each part's color is saved individually, and when the game loads the sprite assets, it checks this list to determine which color file to load in for each part. The end result is some fun combinations, and I'm very happy to have this level of personalization in the game. And the options are just going to continue to grow since I'm always adding new dyes over time. If you'd like to play the game while it's still in development, you can try out Moonshire for free on Steam. And be sure to add the game to your wishlist while you're at it. I really appreciate all of your support, and thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video.